The atmosphere inside the jewelry store was far from welcoming for someone like him. The soft sound of classical music in the background, the impeccable lighting over the showcases full of luxury products, and the scent of expensive perfumes all seemed to disdain his presence. The old black man felt, once again, that he was just a shadow in the world of appearances. It wasn't the first time he'd felt invisible in a place like this, where glances were quick but carefully judgmental. And as always, he tried to steer clear of the obvious, to avoid his skin color being a factor in how he would be treated. After all, he had come there with a simple goal, to buy a watch. Nothing more. But soon, something he had feared, although it was no surprise, happened. When he entered the store, it wasn't the warm greeting he'd imagined, but an appraising look. The security guard standing near the entrance watched him with a curiosity that quickly turned to thinly veiled disdain. The old man smiled slightly and nodded, as if to say good morning, but the security guard didn't even return the gesture. He only looked at him for a second before turning his attention to the door, waiting for the next customer. It was expected. He knew what was coming next, but as always, he tried not to take it personally. Deep down, the old man's soul was armored against this kind of situation, but he couldn't help noticing the small details, the fear in the security guard's posture, the slight exchange of glances between him and the saleswoman in the watch section, as if he wasn't worthy of her attention. With a firm step, he made his way to the watch section. It wasn't the first time he bought a luxury item, but with each new visit to this type of store, with each new cold reception, the pain of discrimination couldn't be erased. He knew that the price of things wasn't a problem for him. But it wasn't the money that bothered him. It was the idea of being treated as if he couldn't understand the value of what he was buying. The saleswoman, a young, slender woman, looked him up and down before asking in an impersonal tone, "Can I help you with something?" He, polite as ever, replied that he was interested in seeing the model of watch in the window. She hesitated for a moment, looking at him again, and then replied, "I can show you something more affordable. Perhaps a simpler watch is what you're looking for." The old man, with his imperturbable expression, was quiet for a moment. He knew what this meant. It was a veiled attempt to reduce him to his appearance and social class. He smiled, but this time with a smile full of experience and knowledge. "I want that watch over there, the one in the window," he said, pointing to the model on display. The saleswoman still hesitated, looking at him again with a look of disguised judgment. "Are you sure?" she asked, clearly uncomfortable with the idea that he, apparently without resources, would want something along those lines. The old man took a deep breath, and the mere doubt of that young woman, still not knowing who he was dealing with, made him feel a slight pressure. But it wasn't a negative pressure. It was just the weight of people's ignorance, the difficulty of accepting that a simple man doesn't mean being poor or incapable. He once again replied calmly, "Yes, I'm sure." But what really bothered him was not the saleswoman's lack of respect, but the way she was being led to see him through a filter of stereotypes. He knew that, behind that cold, distant gaze, she would never imagine that he owned those stores. She would never have imagined that he could buy not just the watch she wanted to deny, but all the watches in the window if he wanted to. And the most painful truth, she would never know the story behind that man, the path of overcoming, the sacrifices and struggles he had faced to get where he was. At that moment, he began to realize how much society was still rooted in limited conceptions of who can have access to what and who doesn't deserve to be treated with dignity. That simple gesture of mistrust touched him more than he would like to admit, but at the same time, he knew that this situation, once again, only showed what he already knew, that he had to prove himself all the time, that he would still have to deal with the weight of discrimination while other people, who would never truly know him, would continue to treat him as if he were less than he was. And it was at that moment, when he saw the saleswoman move away slightly and make way for another attendant, that he felt there was something more that needed to be done. Something more than simply buying a watch. The old man knew that somehow he had to make that jewelry store learn a lesson. A lesson that wouldn't come from angry words or gestures, but from something much deeper. The old man remained silent, watching the saleswoman and the other employees around him. He knew that what was happening there was not an isolated mistake, but part of a larger system where appearance and prejudice guided people's actions, sometimes without them even realizing it. He felt an inner heat rising, not from anger, but from a firm resolve. He wasn't just a simple man in a luxury store. He was someone who had fought against everything and everyone to get where he was. The watch he had chosen, that imposing model, was not just a luxury object for him. It was a symbol of his journey, of overcoming, of all the humiliations he had faced throughout his life, and which he could now finally begin to dissolve, not with shouting or confrontation, but with wisdom and strategy. He didn't let himself be intimidated by the saleswoman's approach. Instead, he took a deep breath and waited patiently. The young woman, still skeptical, wanted to get another employee to help him, as if he was incapable of making a decision for himself. The situation was dragging on, and he knew he had to act before his patience ran out. When the new attendant arrived, the old man took a closer look at the young man. He seemed more helpful, more aware, perhaps because of a more refined education, or because he was aware of the importance of the customer. But the old man knew that the attendant's attitude was also being shaped by what he saw. Just like the saleswoman, the clerk looked at him with a cold, appraising expression, as if the mere fact that he was there was a mistake. And it was at that moment that something unexpected happened. The old man, with a smile that combined wisdom and lightness, pulled out a worn leather wallet from his pocket. Not the leather wallet the businessman would use, but a simple wallet he had carried with him for years. He opened it slowly, and there, at the bottom of the wallet, were some business cards. These are no ordinary cards. They were business cards that bore the name of his company, the name of an empire he had built up over decades. He didn't say anything at first, but the silence between him and the clerk began to grow heavy. The attendant, still suspicious, looked at the old man with a questioning look. When the man saw that the attendant didn't seem to understand, he spoke calmly. "I am the owner of this store." The silence was absolute for a few seconds. The clerk blinked in surprise and looked at the saleswoman, who was standing at a distance, and then looked at the old man again, as if trying to process what he had just heard. "Excuse me, sir, but the clerk stammered, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, while the old man just looked at him patiently. "Yes, I own this jewelry store," he repeated. Now, with the attendant's countenance visibly disconcerted, the old man continued, "Not just this store, but several others. I created all this with my own efforts." At this point, the old man knew he didn't need to raise his voice or create a confrontation. He wanted the saleswoman and everyone around him to understand one thing. A man's value lies not in what he looks like, nor in what he is physically, but in what he is able to achieve and build over the course of his life. This watch I'm buying is one of the simplest things I can acquire in my life. But this moment here is much more important than the purchase. It symbolizes my story and everything I've been through to get here. And the next time someone comes in here, I hope they'll be treated a little more fairly, based on what really matters. The impact of the old man's words hung in the air like an electric charge. The attendant, who had been so convinced of his initial judgment, was now visibly stunned. He looked at the business cards, at the old man, and again at the saleswoman, who didn't know what to make of the revelation. The discomfort in the room was palpable. The silence stretched on for several seconds, while the clerk tried in vain to process what he had just heard. The old man remained impassive, in no hurry to explain, knowing that time and the reality of his words would be more than enough to teach him a valuable lesson. The saleswoman, who hadn't approached him since the revelation, now felt the pressure of having been caught in her own ignorance. It was clear that, at that moment, both young employees were confronting not only the man in front of them, but also their own flaws and deep-rooted prejudices. The old man looked at the watch he had chosen and calmly said, "You can charge me full price now, but I hope that one day you will understand that what is really worthwhile in life is not what you see straight away. Everything that seems great often comes from something invisible to the eye, like effort, perseverance, and, above all, respect." The words echoed not only in the jewelry store, but in the minds of everyone present. The clerk, who had initially been disconcerted, began to realize what was happening. He approached the old man, this time with a different posture, more humble and thoughtful. "I didn't know," he admitted in a lower, almost imperceptible voice. But the old man wasn't there to make excuses. He knew that this moment was not about guilt, but about learning. "It's not about knowing," he replied calmly, "but about recognizing that every human being has a story that isn't visible at first glance. When we judge by appearance, we only see part of the truth." The attendant, now visibly touched by the wisdom of the man in front of him, didn't know what to say, but his attitude spoke for itself. He opened the cash drawer, took out the receipt, and began to register the purchase of the watch. The old man looked at the saleswoman, who was now watching the scene from afar, and said with a quiet smile, "Life will teach you, just as it taught him." The saleswoman, her face flushed with embarrassment, bowed her head. She knew that this was a moment of change, not just for her, but for everyone there. The jewelry store, which had once seemed like a place of superficial luxury, was now the scene of a profound lesson in what it really means to judge someone. The old man knew that the impact of his words would not die there. He stood up calmly, picked up his watch, and gave the attendant and the saleswoman one last look. They didn't need to say anything more. What mattered was clear. It wasn't the power of money or appearance that mattered, but the true measure of a man, which is revealed through his actions, character, and, most importantly, the respect he deserves. "Remember that one day, you two will be in my place," he said before leaving behind not only the jewelry store, but a lesson that would continue to reverberate for a long time. The old man left the jewelry store with a peaceful smile on his face, but inside he felt a sense of mission accomplished. He knew that he hadn't just bought a watch, but planted a seed of reflection, something that, over time, would grow and change the way those young people saw the world. The jewelry store, which had previously been just a place of consumption and ostentation, would become a place of learning for them. The clerk and the saleswoman, now silent, looked at each other one last time before going back to work, but there was something different in their expressions. It was no longer contempt, no longer quick judgment. Now there was a silent realization that behind each person there is a story, a unique and unrepeatable trajectory that deserves to be respected. For the old man, the moment in the jewelry store was more than a lesson in prejudice. It was a reminder that true power does not come from how we are perceived, but from what we are able to build over time and effort. He knew that society often tries to reduce people to labels and appearances, but the real victories are those that cannot be measured by the gaze of others. And as he walked through the streets, feeling the cool afternoon breeze, he didn't worry about the jewelry store, the watch, or what people thought of him. He knew that a man's true wealth is not measured by what he owns, but by the integrity and respect he earns, without ever having to humiliate or reduce himself to please. The old man, with his wisdom and serenity, demonstrated that the dignity of a human being is something that cannot be taken away by anyone, no matter how hard they try. He already had everything he needed: inner peace, self-respect, and the certainty that his actions spoke louder than any judgment. And so his presence left a silent echo in the jewelry store, something the two young men would probably never forget. It wasn't a simple purchase. It was a lesson that would change their lives forever. Just for those of you who like a good story and have watched to the end, leave your comment below from which city you're watching, and I'll leave a heart in your comment. Bye, and see you in the next video.